I call this meeting to order at 6:30. Good evening and welcome to the 7th Customer Advisory Committee meeting. I don't really have any introductory comments tonight besides thanking you for coming in the 105-degree temperature. We've done the rainiest night in Citrus Heights, and I think this is the hottest day so far. So thank you all for your dedication and coming forward. We'll just take one item out of order for public comment. I do have a member of the public that would like to speak on an agenda item tonight. I'll open the public hearing at 6:35. Sherlyn Clark.
Thank you. My name is Sherlyn Clark, and I have been a resident and homeowner in Citrus Heights for over 42 years at the same address, so I'm deeply vested in the community. And I just want to stop and really thank the Citrus Heights Water District and this advisory committee for creating a forum where we, the community, can have input into future planning in the Water District. I think it's so progressive, and thank you for the opportunity. I know we're on the initial planning stages for future replacements, so the only comment that I have is that since we are in the initial planning stages, if at all possible, incorporate within our planning strategy means by which we can minimize any damage to personal property as we move forward. We have that opportunity now because we're in the beginning initial process. To remedy that is plan strategies to minimize any damage to personal property or rectify it should it occur, be it replacement services, tax credits, or something. For individuals such as myself, I'm 70 and on a fixed income, and I'm not the only one in my neighborhood. No one came around 42 years ago and told me, don't plant that there because, you know, if we need to come on your property, this may have to be torn down. And I'd hate for myself or those people around me that I've come to consider my own family, my close neighbors around me. I don't want myself or them to go through the choice of replacing property, any damaged property or landscaping, or contributing to blight of our neighborhood. I'm a very concerned property owner, and I share that value of many of my neighbors, and I do value Citrus Heights, or else I would not have stayed here for 42 years and done the best that I can to be a light in my community and to reach out to my neighbors. So that's my comment. And I think with that consideration in our planning strategies, Citrus Heights Water District can be a model for other districts, not only in Sacramento, but even beyond Sacramento. So thank you for this opportunity just to state my comment about the planning process. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak on a non-agenda item? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. It is 6:37. Laura.
Great. Well, Laura Mason-Smith, I'm so glad to be with you again. Excited for tonight. And so let's take a look at the agenda and just get a sense of what it is that you'll be accomplishing. We have already had our public comment. Thank you so much. And you will be approving the minutes of our last meeting, which was on March 19th. And then you will look at the remaining two spending funding alternatives. These are the two alternatives that you all narrowed down to last time and that went for research. So just an update again, looking back at those. And then we will hear from Brian Godby at Godby Research about the research results. And you'll have an opportunity after hearing those to be able to ask questions and get answers. And at that point, you will then narrow down to your top alternative recommendation to the board. So that's really the primary purpose for tonight. You'll then preview the 8th meeting, which is coming up in September, where you'll be looking at implementation plans, and we'll clarify next steps and wrap up. We have until 9:30. If we don't take that long, we'll just end early. So, but that's what our schedule is. And of course, there will be a break in the middle. So that's the plan. And so let's just go around the room and have you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Laura. Good evening, Andrew McDonald, the project manager for Harrison Associates.
Good afternoon, Habib Isaac, financial and utility rate consultant to the district.
Hello, I'm Brian Godby with Godby Research.
Ray Reilly, board member.
Good evening. I'm Hillary Strauss, General Manager with Citrus Heights Water.
I'm Kimberly Berg. I own Citrus Heights Car Wash and also represent the Auburn Boulevard Business Association.
Bren Martinez, residential representative.
Dave Mitchell with Sunrise Recreation Park District.
Peg Pinard, residential representative.
Deborah Cartwright, residential.
Javed Siddiqui, residential.
Jim Monteaton, residential representative.
Patty Catalano, residential.
Michael Goebel, residential.
Suzanne Guthrie, residential.
Mike Nishimer, representing Sunrise Marketplace.
Ray Bulkey, residential.
Chris Ralston, San Juan Unified.
Rick Moses, residential.
Jenna Moser, residential.
Chris Castrita, Citrus Heights Water District, Chief Board Clerk.
Missy Pieri, Citrus Heights Water District, Engineering Manager.
Roger Cohn, Technical Support.
Madeline Henry, Citrus Heights Water District, Management Services Specialist and Deputy Board Clerk.
Tamar Dawson, Citrus Heights Water, Assistant Engineer.
Paul Dietrich, Citrus Heights Water, Project Manager, thanks.
Rex Muir, Citrus Heights Water District, Water Efficiency Supervisor.
David Gordon, Operations Manager.
Susan Telwar, Administrative Services Manager.
And let's have our one guest who did not speak just introduce herself.
Carol Sheehan, I'm the President of the Board of Directors of the Citrus Heights Water District.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll turn it back to Jenna.
At this time, we'll move on to approval of the March 19th, 2019 CAC meeting, including the frequently asked questions and responses from the district. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Have a motion.
Okay. I'll take Richard for the motion. Do I have a second? Okay, thank you, Suzanne. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, carries unanimously. Missy, I think you're going to take our first item.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Just like I've done in the past, just like to give a roadmap of where we are and where we're going and kind of highlight some of the key things that we've done in the past. So you have in front of you your placemats if you'd like to look at that, but up on the slide is kind of a layout of our project. We have the technical elements on the top and then the various workshops along the bottom. And so what we've done to date is everything highlighted in the orange. And more recently, workshop number 6, we narrowed down all of the alternatives down to the top 2 alternatives. And then those were passed on to Godby Research for a market survey. And then tonight, for workshop number 7, we'll be reviewing those results. Brian Godby will be going over that with you all. And then Harris will also be reviewing some steps for implementation. And then we have one last meeting after this, we're almost there. Workshop number 8 will be in September. And that workshop will really highlight the steps, the implementation steps for the chosen top alternative. So thank you all for your contribution. And, you know, we really look forward to this last meeting and tonight's meeting as well. And this is just a highlight of the project elements. Everything in gray have been completed. And then we're down really past the market research piece, but I have that highlighted in blue because that's what Brian will be talking about tonight. And then at the next meeting, we'll be going over the phasing and implementation plan. And then as you can see along the right, you know, this is a public engagement piece where you're all involved. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Habib and he can review the remaining 2 alternatives.
Thank you, Missy. Good evening. I'm briefly going to go over the last 2 alternatives that we went to market research. You also have a handout that shows both of these slides together, the tables. But the first one is showing the 2 alternatives, 5.4 and 6.4. And with the description, we're showing what is included in those alternatives. Both have pre-funding and both have debt. The pre-funding for 5.4 is $22.5 million. 6.4 had $29.4 million. And then the total amount of improvements that's going to be funded by debt is 4% and 9% respectively. The amount of replacement you have over the term of this project timeline is 72% for 5.4 and then 89% for 6.4. There's a very substantial amount of replacement in either one of these options. And then total cost is in 2018 dollars, $390 million and $480 million. And then with the pre-funding and with the debt being utilized, this allowed us to get to an annual spending amount of 7.8 and 9.6. If we didn't have those two components, these dollar amounts would be much higher, as we showed you when we had, 21 different alternatives. And then just to keep in mind with those percentage of debt that we're using, it does tack on interest that gets accrued that becomes part of the total project cost. So that is the addition to the project cost in 2018 dollars. And then showing you a little bit more information when we look at the pre-funding itself. That pre-funding was something we looked at prior to 2030 on an annual basis. If we spread that over 10 years, it would be $2.25 million a year for 5.4 and slightly more for 6.4 at 2.9. And then if we incorporate that into a monthly surcharge on the meter, based on the meter size, for a 1-inch meter, it would be $8.63 for 5.4 and $11.27 for 6.4. That will remain constant throughout all 10 years, every single month. And that generates the 2.2 and the 2.9. Also keep in mind that it would also accrue interest earnings over time above and beyond this dollar amount. But that would be a segregated account for this, these monies to go into, so it's only used for Project 2030. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Habib. Good evening. Happy to be here this evening to talk about the results of the market research. But before we dive into that, I think our first slide just gives you a quick update of how we got to this point in the research process. It started back several months ago. At least I remember the weather was 65 and sunny, not 105 and scalding. And that's when we had our kickoff meeting, and that was to talk about all of the issues that you might want to test. We then looked at existing data that you had, and that included some of the work you've done on the engineering and finance level. Then we attended the last workshop that you were at, Charles Hester from my team, to get additional input from the members of the committee. From there, we developed the sample, pre-tested and programmed the survey, and then fielded it. And now we are at the analysis and reporting stage, actually the reporting specifically, this evening at workshop number 7. As you go forward with this process, one of the things that is always true of survey research, it's a little bit like peeling an onion. So you're going to get the first several layers tonight. There will always be additional questions as you think about the subsequent layers, and we're certainly available to answer those questions. So diving into the survey, by way of overview, and as you know, this was a survey of local voters and ratepayers that are non-voters, and we did that by matching a list that you had to the voters, fundamentally to get additional information on them so we could contact them. But that left us with some ratepayers that were non-voters, and we wanted to make sure we were covering the entire spectrum. We wanted to gauge awareness of the district. We wanted to look at the perception of the job the district is doing, both to manage water service and the management of public funds. We wanted to assess potential support for, obviously, a rate addition, a rate adjustment or surcharge proposal that could be considered by the board. We wanted to look at various components of the proposal, projects and programs that you might fund with that rate adjustment. We also wanted to test informational. You think of those as positive statements or critical statements because people have different views on everything, and we want to make sure that we tested the entire range. And then we wanted to look and see if there's a rate threshold, and you'll see that as well in the data as we go through here. There's, of course, a variety of demographic and behavioral data that we have for the voter sample that we use to segment it and to make sure that it is representative of the district's voter population. Because of the nature of the ratepayer lists that we used, we don't have the same information for them, so I can't be as certain that it is representative as I can with the voter file. The voter file, I'm certain, is representative, and we call out the different in those two groups. Getting a little bit more into the methodology, survey research has changed dramatically in recent years, as you might guess. In the old days, we called landlines, then we added cell phones, and that was radical. But now we get most of our interviews from text invitations to an online survey. And you can see that was true here as well. As I mentioned earlier, the universe is registered voters primarily, and then the list of ratepayers that did not match with the registered voter file. We were in the field at the beginning of May. The average survey on the phone was 20 minutes long. We don't know how long it takes people to do it online because you can start, go have dinner, watch your favorite TV show, and finish it at 3 in the morning. What we do know is that people hit the submit button at 3 in the morning. So what's changed dramatically from when I started doing survey research is they can take it on their schedule 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We could, of course, never call anybody at 3 in the morning. And in terms of the sample size, we completed 504 registered voters. There were 100 of the ratepayer non-voters for a total of 605. And in terms of the margin of error for the voters, it's 4.33, and the larger group of ratepayers, non-voters, it is 3.95. So jumping into the key findings, as mentioned earlier, the first section that we talk about was awareness and the climate, basically, of the district. And the first question was, have you seen, heard, or read anything about the water district? For voters, about 35%, a little over a third, have said that they have seen, heard, or read something about the district. And for non-voters, it was about half. Again, the non-voters are all ratepayers, so it makes sense that they would be more likely to have heard about you. So we'd expect that to be different. But what's particularly important here is that the vast majority, particularly of the voters, aren't aware of the district. And that you'll see as a theme. The follow-up question for those people who had heard of the district was, what have you seen or heard? And this was an open-ended question, so we took their responses instead of fitting it into our preconceived categories. And as you can see here at the top of the list, and sort of standing out by itself for both groups, was newsletters, pamphlets, flyers, bill insert, etc. So the communications that the district sends to people was the most recalled. Now remember, that's 40% in round numbers of 35% of the voters, so it's not of the entire population. So again, it's a pretty, it becomes a smaller and smaller amount. The second category is higher rates, fees, and increasing, a variety of different responses. Again, it's an open-ended that we try to code together, and some people saying the rates are too high, but that's clearly in a second tier. It's not as important as that first group. And then finally, we have a variety of items that start at 8.4 for the voters and tail off from there. There's just a whole variety of different mentions. I won't go through all of them because they go on to the next page as well. And you can see that the numbers get quite small, and with the error rates I talked about already, they're really insignificant. So the next question in this section dealt with the district's job performance in providing providing water and doing what it is that you do. And the way we analyze this is we first ask, do you have a very favorable, somewhat unfavorable, or very unfavorable opinion? And then to make it easier for analytical purposes and to compare with the wealth of data that we have for a wide variety of different agencies, we combine the very and somewhat together on both sides of the equation. So you've got 60% in round numbers for the voters and 67 for the non-voter group that have a favorable view. And on the lower left-hand corner, you see a ratio, favorable to unfavorable. Basically, we're doing the math. And for the voters, we're at 4.4 to 1. That's really a good place to be in terms of those that are favorable versus unfavorable. It's slightly higher among the non-voter group at 5.2 to 1, so both of those are good scores. What, though, stands out, and it's not atypical that it stands out, is that gray section of each bar, and that's the people that don't know. And you've got about 27% of the voters, 20% of the non-voters that don't have an opinion, and because we're talking about a rate change, I think it's important that all of these people know about what you're doing, and you'll see that theme as I go further. The next question dealt with the job the district is doing to manage public funds. Now, we do the same sort of analysis here. We create that ratio in the box on the lower left-hand corner. Don't be alarmed, it goes down for every agency. And it goes down because obviously we've switched from talking about service, which people have a pretty good handle on in many cases, to finances, which people aren't as aware of. And so the ratio goes down, but you can also see the gray part of the bar has gone up. In both cases, we're at 2.4 to 1 for voters, which again is good for this particular question, 1.5 to 1 for non-voters, positive to negative. I've certainly seen this as low as 0.9 to 1, which is a negative correlation. Obviously, you're not there, so that's good. But while we expect the gray part of the bar to go up, again at 44% for voters and 37% for non-voters, those are people that need to know what's going on. So there is a communications, public outreach effort that this data is suggesting. And as part of this section of the survey, we also asked people whether they thought the district was a city department because of the name or an independent public agency. And as you can see here, 31% of voters, 29% of non-voters thought that the district was a department of the city of Citrus Heights. Another 24% thought it was an independent agency of voters, and then 31% of non-voters. And then again, the gray part of the bar is large. If you add the blue and the gray together, you've got 86% of the people that are voters that either have the wrong idea or don't know. And that again suggests that given this undertaking that there's a community outreach component that needs to happen. So at this point in the survey, we switched gears and we focused on the two options that were described earlier, option 6.4 and option 5.4, and we wrote the question that you see on the right-hand side of the slide to basically describe it and ask people, do you support or oppose this particular proposal? As we discussed previously in the presentation, 6.4 is $480 million 60-year replacement plan with an increase of 3.97%. And so that's what we asked here. There is what we call a split sample. We had randomly selected half of the respondents that took the survey to get this option, and then the other half, again randomly selected, got the other option, which is 5.4. And that way you can sort of compare the two of them head to head instead of just saying, what about this idea and then what about this idea, and the second idea is always conditioned by the first idea. So in this case, we've eliminated that potential bias. As you can see here, we started a pretty good place at 63% in round numbers for voters, a little lower for the non-voters, but with margin of error, there really isn't that much of a difference between the two. And again, at 63% for voters, I think that's a pretty good place to be. When we look at option 5.4, the story is a little different, but again, when you take into account the error rate, it's just on the edge of being statistically different for the voters, but it is numerically lower. It's at 54% in round numbers, and for non-voters, it too is numerically lower at 49%, and this again is the option 5.4. When we drilled down into the details a little more and looked at the demographics, we noticed that this split sample, while randomly selected, was a little more male, a little more homeowner, and so we might expect that they would be a little more conservative with respect to rate increases. But then when we looked at the difference between those groups and the overall, we found that there wasn't a statistically significant difference. So this is all at the very much at the margins, but there are certainly numeric differences. After we asked about the two rate change policies, we then asked, have you seen, heard, or read anything about Project 2030? And what you can see here again very clearly is among voters, only 14% said yes, and among non-voters, 14%, virtually the same statistically. But, again, what is important to note is that 86 and 82% respectively either said I don't know or said I don't know, and that's a slightly nuanced difference, but it falls in the same category. Those are people that need more information about the project. At this point in the survey, we then switched gears a little bit and wanted to drill down into what the individual components of the proposal would do to support, whether increase support or decrease support. And so we had this list that you see here on the left side of the slide, and we asked these items in a random order. The order you see here is the ranking that we've created after the fact. But we basically said if you heard that the proposal would replace 15 water mains that cross creeks and are at a heightened risk for failure, would you be more or less likely to support the measure? And then we drilled down, is that much more likely or somewhat more likely? Same thing on the negative side. When we're done with the interviewing, we go back and assign the numeric values that you see across the bottom of the slide. Much more likely is a 2, a somewhat more likely is a 1, a somewhat less likely is a -1, and a much less likely is a -2. The reason we do that is not to just confuse things, although sometimes that's what it does, but we want to create what we call an intensity or a mean score, and that's what you see associated with the bars, the 0.87 down to the -0.39. The reason we do that is because if we just added percentages, you could have an item that was 40% much more likely and 20% somewhat more likely, that's 60%, right? But you could also have another item that was 20% much more likely and 40% somewhat more likely, also 60%, but you can see the intensity is entirely different. So if we were to just add those two together, we'd say they were the same. They wouldn't be the same, and that's what this intensity score does. Now, it's even more sophisticated than that example because it has a negative side of the equation as well, and we want to take that into account too. And so this score, while seeming abstract, does that exactly. We also, for statistical reasons, we group them into what we call our tiers, and basically that means that while there may be numeric differences within a tier, the high to low are statistically tied within each tier. So in Tier 1, we have the item I already read, replace 15 water mains that cross creeks. We also have replaced the majority of aging distribution mains from 4 inches to 12 inches in diameter. There's a numeric difference in those, but statistically they are tied. And they range from that 0.87 or down to 0.67. You can also look at the arrow on the far right-hand side and sort of see the range of percentages if you did what I said we don't want to do, but which is adding just the much more likely and somewhat more likely together, but it puts it into context for people generally. So you can see at the top of Tier 1, we're at about 66%, at least somewhat more likely to support the measure, knowing that it's going to fix those mains that cross creeks. At the bottom end of the spectrum, you see a couple items that are actually negative, so they reduce support. And the first one is increases rate 6% for 20 years, and then the rate increases would be as low as 2.8% during the remainder. And the same thing, this was actually a split sample, so there was associated with the 5.4 and 6.4, so the numbers are a little bit different. But the point that is, I think, important here is when you're talking about the things people get, I get the solution to the problem of mains crossing creeks, I get aging mains replaced, people are supportive. When you start talking about the details, particularly with respect to the cost, that's where people get negative. So in terms of the communications effort, you want to talk about the things that that people want to get out of the measure, not necessarily the nuts and bolts of how you make that happen. The next two slides are what we call the informational statements, and the methodology for these is similar. All of these items are asked in a random order. These are largely positives, and people understand them as they read them themselves or they're read to them on the phone to be positives. So the scale changes, because when people hear these kinds of items, it doesn't make sense that they would be less likely to support the measure. So the scale is just much more likely, somewhat more likely, no effect. We can still do the same thing with respect to an intensity score, but the caveat is you just can't compare the 1.25 in this set of questions with the previous set of questions, because it's a different response category. But we still create the tiers as we did in the previous one, and the interesting thing here is everything on this slide is on tier 1. They're technically statistically tied. They range from 1.25 to 1.08, or 73% in round numbers to 65%. And if you think back to the air rate, you can see that they're grouped together. There's lots of things on this list. There's, in fact, when I go to the next slide, you'll see there's one more item in tier 1. But what I thought was interesting is they sort of group into similar categories. It's much more cost effective to be proactive and plan replacement instead of reacting to emergency failures. The proposal does not increase property taxes. That's one unto itself. The third one is less costly to replace aging water mains based on thoughtful engineering analysis before they break. So again, that planning component. The fourth is the transmission mains were installed in the 50s, and many are more than 60 years old and nearing the end of their useful life. And then rounding out the top 5, transmission main failures at creek crossings could cause major environmental damage, costing ratepayers money. There's some other items that planned replacement comes up in a couple different places in those items. So planning is important to people, and planning to save money is particularly what's important. And this is the remainder of the informational statements. As I mentioned, the first one here is technically in tier 1, so it's grouped with the rest of the items we just saw, and that is the district has been well managed and has very low staff costs compared to other similar water districts, and that's important to people at 1.06, or about 59%, at least somewhat more likely to support the measure. From there, we have items that are positive, but they're not clearly as positive as all those items that you saw on the previous slide. And again, as we're thinking about how to explain this project to people, we don't want to be talking about these items because they don't help us. We want to be talking about these items because those are important to people. Now, we also looked at the other side of the coin, as I mentioned at the outset, and so we have a list of critical statements, and in fact, the informational statements and the critical statements were rotated in the survey. So half of the respondents got the informational statements first, half of the respondents got the critical statements first, and that's designed to adjust for what we call position bias, where if you always had things in the same order, the beginning items impact the final items items, and we didn't want that to happen, so we rotate the order here. The methodology is the same as what we just described for the informational statements. We don't put a minus sign in front of the number to make it seem bad. The higher it is, the worse it is. The more people are likely to oppose the proposal. And in Tier 1, you can see there are a variety of items at the top of that list. The proposal will cost ratepayers $48 million in interest charges. That 1.12 is 55% at least somewhat more likely to oppose the measure. So that doesn't make people happy. The project would take 60 years to complete and allows costs to spiral out of control. The Water District has increased rates every year for the last 4 years. The Water District wastes money on expensive consultants and Taj Mahal-like facilities, and the Water District spends 25% of every ratepayer dollar on staff salaries and pensions. That's a pretty common negative for these kinds of revenue-related items. The total project and interest will cost ratepayers more than $1.6 billion. And finally, in Tier 1, the total project and interest will cost more than $1.3 billion. Again, those were split samples related to Proposal 6.4 or 5.4. So after they've heard all the things that we might spend the money on, they've heard the informational statements and the critical statements, again in a random order, we then come back to the proposals to look at support or opposition. And this again is 6.4. Wording is identical to the first test. And when we look at voters, which I think again, because we know that it's representative of the voting population, it's probably more informative, but we're at 62% in round numbers on the final ask. The level of strongly support has gone up slightly. It's not statistically significant, but it's the way we would expect it to go. The overall total yes is down just a little bit, 0.8%, so slightly lower, but again, statistically virtually the same. And for the non-voters, we've gone up a larger amount, but with the smaller sample size there, the error rate is higher. So again, statistically, they're tied. If we average the voters and non-voters, I think it was interesting to note that we wind up at 62% overall, which is, again, I think a good place for this kind of policy. Certainly, we work for lots of cities that put measures actually on a ballot that win at 51%. And those are sales tax measures and parcel tax, well, not parcel tax, but sales tax measures, utility taxes, those sorts of things. So this is substantially above that level. Now, we weren't sure where we were going to wind up in this question, so we had a fallback. And basically, it was instead of the 3.97% additional rate, what if it were 2.97? And you can see for the voters, we go from that 62% up to about 66%. Statistically, it's not significant, but it's certainly numerically of note, and it's going the direction we would expect it, so it's probably accurate. And the level of strongly support goes up as well. So there is probably some rate sensitivity, and 2.97 sounds better than 3.97. Of course, there is a context here as well. They've heard about the 3.97, so anything that's less is going to be better. So that's a component of what you're seeing as well. But I think there is some rate sensitivity in here. Looking at the same analysis for option 5.4, we're now at 55%, so again, up just slightly among the voters. Statistically not significant, a numeric change. Again, it's going the direction we would like to see. Among non-voters, we're at 40%, which is a decrease, so they were less happy with this. Again, remember, there's a few more men and a few more homeowners in this sample, so that could be why, but again, there wasn't a statistical difference based on just those segments. The average is 48% in round numbers, I think, again, the voters are probably the better place to look here, and so they're at 55%. If we compare that 55% with the 62%, and again, I'm rounding, that we saw on option 6.4 with the air rate, there really isn't a statistical difference between these two policies, even though there are some differences in the gross amount of the projects, 390 for this million for this version versus the 480 million version, and this rate is slightly higher. This is 3.99 versus 3.97, but I don't think that has an impact here. I think this is just within the margin of error. Again, we had a follow-up question, which was going from 3.99 to 2.99, and again, there is rate sensitivity. Statistically speaking, it's not significant, but numerically it is certainly different, and it's going the direction, again, we would expect it to, so that gives us a little more confidence in saying that there is a rate sensitivity in both of these samples, and so that may be something to consider. So by way of summary, and then I can answer questions that you might have, there's certainly limited awareness among the districts, about the district among registered voters. And I think that's something that you need to really take away from this and say we have to do more public outreach about this program and about the district as a whole. Having said that, the favorability ratios for job performance and management of financial resources are good, but there are big chunks of people that don't know, and you want to not have those people not knowing when you've got an additional rate that's being proposed. Awareness of the project specifically is also limited, so again, more reason to do the public outreach. And then just summing what we really just talked about in terms of the two options, we start in the 60s with option 6.4 and stay there, so I think that's a pretty solid number. We're a little lower with option 5.4, but if you average the two of those, since they're not much different in terms of the proposals, you're still in the very low 60s, and I think that's a good place for both of those to be. The top tier features, as we talked about, are replacing 15 water mains that cross creeks, replacing the majority of distribution mains from 4 to 12 inches, replacing 209 miles of distribution mains, again, different wording, replace 15 miles of transmission mains, pipes larger than 12 inches, and replacing fire hydrant and water service to residents and businesses. In terms of the key messages that voters particularly found of interest was it's much more cost effective to be proactive and plan replacement instead of reacting to emergency. The proposal is not a property tax. That's really important. It is less costly to replace aging water mains based on engineering analysis before they break rather than incurring emergency replacement costs. So again, being proactive. Transmission mains are 60 years old and nearing the end of their useful life, so that also fits into the proactive message. And the transmission main failures at creek crossings could cause environmental damage. So again, this is one of the same things we saw in the features is important here as well. And again, there were some areas of concern, and that was largely when we got into the details of cost. $48 million in interest charges, 60 years to complete. Those are things that are not really the benefits to the average ratepayer. They're the cost, but like anything, when you go to buy something, you buy a set of features and benefits, you don't buy the price at the end of the day, and that's what we're seeing here. So given the survey findings, we think that the Water District's Board of Directors should feel confident that in the level of community support for the Project 2030 main replacement and move the process forward. However, and as I've said throughout the presentation, the limited awareness of the district and its job performance and the Project 2030 are indicators that public outreach needs to happen and really is essential in explaining what you're planning to do with the main replacement for the community. So that completes the presentation for this evening. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions.
Can I ask a very obvious question, and I'm probably going to feel very stupid for asking this, but are more people for a higher monthly rate than the lower monthly rate? Is that
yes.
what I'm really reading here?
Yeah, but I think that the rate difference that we're talking about is almost inconsequential. I mean, it's 3.99 versus 3.97, and most people couldn't calculate that.
What about what's on this page, though, where it says the monthly meter surcharge? I mean, that's a pretty direct number.
Well, that's not part of the survey. That's part of the financial and engineering analysis. I mean, the survey can't get in.
So they didn't know these monthly charges?
No,
just go on the 2.9.
Just what was in that, right. And now I think what is also, though, clear is that there is a rate sensitivity. So when you go from 3.99 to 2.99 and 3.97 to 2.97, there is a rate sensitivity when you have that level of difference. I really don't think it's a rate difference of 0.02.
Not when you say it that way, but when you ask somebody, is
right.
$8 a month okay, or is $11 a month?
Right, which we didn't ask them.
They're going to answer pretty quickly.
Yeah, right.
Will a stepped-up public awareness of this project add cost to the 2030 project, or is it part of that cost of the 2030 project?
I don't know the answer to that. I would defer to staff or your communications specialists for that answer.
Outreach and communications costs are part of our ongoing budgeted operational costs. So currently we have a budget for communications, for public outreach, for things such as our newsletters and for the goings on of the Customer Advisory Committee. The specific things that we're studying would be to take on additional capital improvement programs to replace more water mains. At the same time, we are currently looking into ways in which to revamp and improve upon our communications and outreach program, so that way we can improve the way in which we tell our message and the means in which we tell our story, so that way we're hopefully going to be telling it a whole lot more and a whole lot better.
I'll just piggyback a little bit on what Chris said. Chris did a great job of highlighting that public engagement is part of the district's ongoing budgets. As part of the specific project budget, there is additional money in that budget, the big numbers, to include additional public outreach and support.
If I may, prior to any of our capital improvement projects actually being built, we do send out letters to all of the customers so they're aware of the project and, well in advance of the project. So we do have some of that public outreach.
So we talked to, obviously the question dealt with rate increases. Was there a part of the survey that explained the fixed monthly meter surcharge that's going to happen during the pre-funding period?
No, we didn't get into that detail. We did talk about the pre-funding issue, though, and that was in the critical statements. And let me just see which one it was. But predictably, when you talk about things like pre-funding and interest rates, those don't test particularly well, which is why they were in the critical statements. I mean, again, people want to hear what they're getting, not what it's costing them. So while you obviously have to talk about both things, I think it's important that you really stress what they're getting and not spend all your time talking about the cost. Because if you did that at Target, we'd never buy anything. And that's what the data is showing, that you really have to talk about what it is that's the benefit to people, whether that be water service or environmental issues, all of those things that we talked about. That's really the important takeaway here.
I can certainly see where that is important in a survey. I just think the district needs to be well aware to be clear on the differences and the fact that there is a monthly service charge that is going to be a huge hit, and then initially and be a shock to folks, and then when it's there every month, it is definitely going to spark some conversation and perhaps some unhappiness if it's not clearly explained up front that this is absolutely necessary to make this project happen.
Right, and I think that's part of the communications outreach that needs to happen.
If I may chime in, this is Chris. One thing to note, Brian, if you can turn to slide 31. In the informational statements, there was additional discussion of pre-funding and the fact that it would in fact be reducing cost on the back end in the years 2030 and onwards. And so that was one of the things that was being measured, was an understanding of how that storyline of the way in which pre-funding works whether it would help to sell the project or hinder the project. And so I do think we do need to continue to relay that message. But Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, it appears as though a focus upon that message is not going to be as beneficial to describing the benefits of the Project 2030 as the actual benefits and replacements of the meters.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. The item that Chris is talking about is the second one there. It's item S, and all of these things are more important to people. So if you think about a typical communications effort, you got about 30 seconds. That's a soundbite, and that's 3. It's not all of those and the top 2 on this list. People aren't going to pay attention. I know in this group, you do, because it's your charge, and you spent hours and hours and days doing that. The average ratepayer doesn't. They're going to hear 1, 2, 3, our 30 seconds is up.
What else would you like to know about the survey?
I just want to say thank you. And I felt that the survey was very thorough, and the questions covered some areas that I actually wasn't anticipating being relevant to this project, but ended up sort of coming around in that way, which I thought was really important. As far as do you recognize the name of this agency? Are you a city agency? Are you independent? I didn't quite put that together at first, but it really makes sense now. That some more outreach is important. I also do understand that you don't want to lead with this is going to cost you $10 more a month, because that's kind of where the conversation ends. You want to start with something maybe a little bit more positive and get to this is going to cost you $10 more. So I think we have to start somewhere else. Otherwise, you're starting at a pretty confrontational place already. So ease in with the benefits and then hit with the tenor. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'd like to just kind of piggyback on what you just brought up about the approach. I think most people do understand that you need to replace your pipes. And I think that you got just from trying to follow you as quickly as you were going through all this, you basically got a pretty positive response, so people understand it. They didn't say, hell no.
Right.
Okay?
That's
so it was a matter of kind of pulling out, even from them, how much and how fast. And I think that, the national news has kind of done a help in that regard. I mean, I would be surprised if anybody hadn't heard about the lead in the pipes in Flint. And that, I think, triggered everybody. Oh, yes, we need to watch our infrastructure. So I think you have something really good to base it on. And I wouldn't be so afraid of all the little nitty-gritty things, but you got a really good positive response, I think, from just the issue being brought up. And I think I would build on that. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. How about other comments or questions? There was a question that was brought up in our public comment, And did you want to address that, Missy?
Yeah, I believe the question was, is there funding in the project cost for damaged items such as, property damage? And for every project, we do put in a contingency. Depending on the type of project, you might have more contingency, you may have less, depending, if it's a smaller pipeline in a residential street versus a large pipeline running down Sunrise Boulevard. So you would have different type levels of contingency there. Obviously, we try to minimize those impacts to the public, but there is some contingency for any, issues that do arise. Hopefully that answers your question.
And then Patty, you brought that up also, so.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Following up on that one, you put up a map early on about the pipes that need replacing, and you showed some areas where it went through people's property. Remember that? You kind of said, well, these are problems that are going to come up along the way. Is there an effort to try to reroute some of those old routes that still go through someone's property by hooking it up in the front or something to a main line? Because if it's a problem now that it still runs through someone's property, it's going to be a problem the next time somebody goes through this. So usually this is an opportunity to try to make sure you get the routes back to public right-of-ways and things that make sense in 2019, 20.
Definitely agree with that, and we certainly try, and that's why we're planning so far in advance, because those are very complicated issues, and it's not something that can be resolved in a year's time. It takes several years to coordinate with, various agencies, the city of Citrus Heights or the county or Sunrise Rec and Park. There's several projects that are happening right now that we may be able to work together with various agencies, in the future. So we are looking at that, because to minimize water mains going through people's backyards or side yards is something we'd like to do.
Especially if you have a length of something that goes through, it would be, in the interest of all that you've done here in terms of outreach, is to get together with neighborhoods and where you have this issue, and then say, let's talk about what we can do or not do, what our options are, and maybe after you do a little research with some of these other agencies, because you don't want to just be kicking the can down the road.
Agreed, and there's a lot of public outreach in those projects.
Exactly. Build on that.
So, any other questions or observations on the market research? Well, let's say thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we are going to move into a break, but before we do so, we'd like to get just a sense from the voting members of the CAC of where you're leaning. Do you support both alternatives? You'd be fine with either? Or do you predominantly support one over the other? This isn't a final vote, but it's just a sense. And so what we'd like to do is to have you complete a paper ballot. We'll just gather those. We'll look at those during the break and determine what next steps might be. Given what the results are, we have the option to move into table groups and provide much more information and discussion, or you may be ready to make a final recommendation on those alternatives. So we just like to get a sense. So again, this is just a straw vote, and so we're passing out ballots. And if you would just mark those, you can mark both for options 5.4 or 6.4. And remember, you have the information here on your sheet explaining this. So you could mark both, you'd be fine with either, or you could mark one or the other. So if you would complete that, and then you can just turn it over in front of you, we'll pick those up, and then we'll go on a break. If you do complete it, if you would tuck it under your name tent, then we'll know where they are and we'll pick them up. And we'll go on a 15-minute break and then come back. So, thank you so much for the straw vote. There was overwhelming support for one of the alternatives, but we said that wasn't an official vote. And so it looks like we would be ready just to move to an official vote. If you would like, we can give you back your straw vote, or if you remember what you put, you can just go ahead. Now, this vote really shows one or the other option. It does not give the option of both. So, so those that did vote for both, if you now would choose which one you would prefer. So, Madeline, I think you and Tamar have ballots for people. And again, if you would complete it, and then you can turn it over and stick it under your name tent. We'll pick it up, and then we will announce the results. Oh, and I see that James is not back. So we will wait and make sure to include him. I didn't realize he wasn't back. Or another cookie, there's time. Ah, there he is. So, we announced there was overwhelming support for an alternative. So, James, we're moving into final voting, so you have a green ballot, and if you would complete that, and then we will pick them up. So the results of your votes are 11 for 5.4, 3 for 6.4, and so the 11 for 5.4 exceeds 75%. And can we, and I know that some of you that voted for 6.4 had also on the initial polling said you could vote for either. So it looks like we have a strong support for alternative 5.4. So give yourselves a hand. Any comments when you look at the voting?
Just the discussion really revolved around the fact, and I think was a significant part, at least for me, but also from others I heard, this raise in amount for replacing is only going to be one of many from many agencies across the board. So it's not just the one difference between 8 and 11 or whatever. It's going to be that this is one, and then the electric bill is going to be there, and then the sewer bill is going to be there, and then the cable bill is going to be there, taxes are going to be there. Plus, there's still going to be an increase in water rates if people use more water. And if we get into another drought, you're going to have increase due to perhaps some additional costs that may be drought driven. So I think there's some understanding of, if you want people to be supportive, then I think we need to understand that the gentler the hit, the more likely you will get that kind of support.
Great.
So that's just kind of summing up what we were talking about before,
Great.
if any of you hadn't already figured that out.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Jenna?
I just wanted to add that we had a couple of really great alternatives to look at, and I'm really pleased with either of those alternatives. I wanted to thank you guys again for your work on this. This is pretty important and eye-opening end to our work. Thank you.
Well, and the strong suggestions from the research to focus on creating awareness of the district and the project too, and I know that's a big priority that we've heard from the district.
Yeah, I think the next big challenge is going to be finding out and deciding the approach to move forward to the next phase, which is kind of getting out the information about what we've decided and how you're going to, I hate to say sell that to people, but kind of do that.
So it does not appear that we had the need to move into small table groups, and it looks like we have another comment.
So I'm sure you're not all going to come to our water board meetings when we vote on this issue over the next however long it takes us to get to a final form.
I want to be sure that I'm clear on, there was, Brian, there was no really significant statistical difference between 6.4 and 5.4, but the trend was for the public to be more supportive of 6.4. Is that an accurate, am I on the right page with that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask you, our CAC, this question. You just saw, as a group, the results of a survey that tended towards 6.4, but 3/4 of you disregarded the survey to the public, or didn't vote the same as the survey trend indicated. So when I look at that, I see, the decision is a sound decision. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just trying to understand how I, as an elected, who's going to vote on this, is going to square the difference between the trend and the decision and the vote of this CAC. Is that question clear? So I'd like anybody to respond to it so I can hear what you're saying, because you're the people that I really need to listen to.
So the main deciding factor for me in voting for 5.4 was the fact that at the end of the market research was the key line for me there was no statistical significance difference between the two. And in my mind, that means that if this market research was conducted again today, it could flip the other way. And if it was conducted a month from now, it could reverse again. And for me, at that point when there is no statistical significant difference between the two, I'm going to err on the side of what my opinion and of the totality of the circumstances and what I think would probably be the best option for the community at large. And if all members of the community were sufficiently provided with all of the information to make a educated decision, I feel that that's the decision that a majority would make.
That's why I asked the question I did about were the people given the difference in the monthly rates? Because it's one thing to say I'd like 70% replaced, and then, oh, by the way, another group would like 80% replaced. What you had going for you was that they were at least supportive of that. But then when you said, okay, how much are you willing to pay a month for this? Then I think that's when you get the real response. And so while more people may have said, we'd love to replace all of it, I suppose, if that had even been an alternative. But then if you said, well, that's going to cost you additional $25 a month, they would have said, whoa. So there's a difference between what people would desire, given no costs attached to it, and then perhaps the reality of what that's going to cost per month. And that would be what I would tell people based on what you had here and then what the alternative was selected, at least how I voted. That people were not given the amount that would be a month. And I think that would have been very significant had they been given that.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because when the survey, they said there was no significant statistical difference. I think that was kind of a, that was kind of a gray area there on which option would be better. But when they did the testing for the rate sensitivity, I think that kind of flipped it a little bit more towards the less expensive option for the taxpayers.
Yeah, I agree with all those comments too. It seems, correct me if I'm wrong, but the voting public in this, they weren't privy about both options. They were given one or the other. For me, it's significant that both groups were supportive either way. And since it's pretty insignificant, to me, it's almost like the CAC membership here is a tiebreaker, since we do know about all of the different options available.
I think you have to compare, too, a 20-minute survey to those of us that have been in this process for well over a year. It's education, and it's going through steps of learning what is needed and why it's needed. And, you know, like I said, a 20-minute survey is a lot different than going through this process.
What struck me interesting, too, there's a very large percentage that don't know, or it's NA, which I guess is not available, or they're, you know, what was it?
No answer.
No answer, which is surprising. So I think maybe they're overwhelmed by data. Maybe they really don't care. Maybe they're uninformed. But I agree with your comment that, you know, we have been in this process for well over a year, and we've been immersed in this. If these people maybe knew more of the facts about it could be, you know, more data about what it actually is going to cost them per month, when they really have more of a dollars and cents idea, maybe that would help sway them off the I don't know fence. I don't know, but I thought that was kind of surprised that they don't know, or that it's NA. So I don't know, we can't do this, but if we were to take that percentage and put it towards 5.4, you know, we don't know where they would land on the fence, but, you know, maybe that would sway that towards 5.4. But I think it's important that they get a dollars and cents idea of actually how much their bill's going to go up. I think that would get them off that fence.
I appreciate the rate sensitivity. I think that was part of it for me. Knowing the difference in the monthly meter surcharge was important to me. You know, I'd rather have the higher percentage, but I think it's financially important to be sensitive to our aging population, how many people are you know, on fixed incomes. Okay, now, and different things like that, and how that's going to impact us, you know, and all the ratepayers. Plus, it's sometimes challenging then to look out and think, okay, well, you know, 30 years from now or whenever it is, towards the end of this project, long project, you know, some of these costs aren't going to happen. We won't have as many increases or whatever out then. Well, people are going, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. I'm not going to leave here then. You know, because people don't stay as often as they used to. People used to homestead practically in a place, and you know, society seems to be much more mobile now, which I think is unfortunate from that standpoint. But I also want to say that I'm extremely confident in the water district, and the fact that you guys are going to do what is the right thing for the community when cost effectiveness happens and things happen in economies of scale. I think you're going to get way past this 72% on 5.4. And that will pop up, and it will be a higher amount simply because that's both the goal of the district and the integrity of the staff that you currently have to want to make this project more successful even than it currently is on paper. So I have every confidence in the district that number will go higher, even with the lower funding and the lower, you know, using 5.4 instead of going for 6.4.
Any other comments?
My concern on this too is that I know the difference between the 72 and the 89%, but in that 17% difference, the overall cost per percentage was basically the same in either one of the two groups. It was about, we calculated about $5.4 million for every 1% in either group, in either one you did. And my biggest concern is that I hope that 17% is not where we have a failure between this point, where we could have gotten it fixed, where that means that the cost will actually go up for replacing that than what we intended to. Now, the same could be said, well, then you got 11% on the other one, and it could have happened there too as well. But I figured that 17% difference in what the cost overall was pretty much the same. It's just that how much do you want to replace? I thought it was worthwhile to get the 89% versus the 72% overall. And there just in case there's, to prevent a failure, to lessen the chance of a failure overall. But hey, we'll get 72%, and that's pretty good.
Thank you, Richard. I too preferred the higher completion number when making my selection. The difference in cost was small enough that it made the number look big of how much more you were getting for just that small more increase. I understand that the district will be competing with priorities of citizens with other rate increases. Your water bill is one of your highest priority bills in your household, and I imagine people would prioritize their spending in that same fashion. There's other ways you can put off a rate increase. Water is an essential service.
Thank you so much for those comments. Was that helpful for you, Ray?
Yes, that was very helpful. I appreciate it. And I would like to say that if any of you decide you want to serve on the district board of directors, I would be pleased and honored to have any one of you join us, because the thoughtfulness of this group, the thoughtfulness you've put into these last 8 meetings, makes me feel confident that there are great quality people in this room, and I look forward to seeing you all at other district events and activities.
So we are running ahead of schedule, and in talking with Andrew, I said, Andrew, no one's ever unhappy if we're running ahead of schedule. So he's going to take the next agenda topic, which is just an overview of the implementation plan, and then we will have public comment, we'll clarify the next steps, we'll just get a sense of your takeaways, and we'll wrap up. So Andrew.
So our last topic tonight is just an introduction to implementation planning. When we talk about implementation planning for this project, because this project is not starting construction for 11 years, there's really 2 things to consider. The things that we should be doing between now and 2030, and the things we should plan for when the project starts in 2030. So we'll look at both of those, and we'll break the implementation of the project down into 3 groups. Technical items that we should plan for, continued public engagement that should be planned for throughout Project 2030, and financial planning that should be planned for during Project 2030. So between now and 2030, the project team is going to work together with staff and do a couple things to prepare the district and the community for this project. Some examples of those tasks are continuing with pipe inspections and determining the interval of those inspections throughout the life of the project. Sampling of removed pipe as we continue projects between now and 2030, removing those pipe and testing those pipes to see what we can learn from how our pipes are behaving. And then continuing to update the risk model that we've spent a long time exploring with you guys. If you remember, the risk model is ultimately what's going to determine the priorities of the projects and which pipes get replaced first. So between now and 2030, there's still a lot of work to do to really refine that model. So when we start projects, we have confidence that we're replacing the worst pipes or the most important pipes in the district. So some of the things we'll update that model with between now and 2030, obviously with any replaced pipes that happen between now and 2030, any breaks that happen, any leaks that happen, we're going to document those and inform the model with what type of pipes are breaking and why they're breaking, what age of pipes are breaking and why they're breaking. Any main leaks, similarly, those sizes and locations. And we're also going to validate the current CIP. So as we go through the next 11 years replacing pipes, we want to take a look at each one of those and confirm as we go through that, yeah, that shows up in the risk model in the highest risk. So then when we start the project, we need to have an implementation plan. And so one of the pieces of that is the technical aspects to consider during construction and to plan for. So the implementation plan is going to look at things and consider things that need to happen and be planned for, such as updates to details and standards, looking at different delivery methods of the project. So by delivery method, that means, are we going to have bigger projects or smaller projects? Are we going to manage them with district staff or with outside staff? And how we deliver those projects to the customers. Things like staffing and org charts and other logistics are also important to plan for. The district currently is replacing about $2 million of pipe per year, and as we move to, I think it was going to be $7.2 million per year in the option you guys just selected, that's a big difference. So the district has to look at staffing, logistics, and how they're going to deliver these projects and manage them the way you guys would all expect. Something else that we'll have in our implementation plan is a way to coordinate with the city and county for savings in costs with paving projects. So a project might not be the highest priority project, but if it's really close and we know the county or city is about to pave a road, we want to get in there before they pave that road, so that saves us the cost of having to repave that road once our project is done. A couple technical items that will be included or need to be planned for are how we're going to do plans and specifications, and again, continuing to update the risk model throughout the project as we learn more about the system as we do projects. So the next piece is public engagement. So we're going to want to plan for and have and consider things, some of the things we talked about tonight, and I've been talking about all along, continuing a variety of ways to engage the customers, educate the customers. We're going to want to have a public engagement strategy that is developed by the team and possibly other team members that can specifically help us with public engagement. And we're going to want to develop some benchmarks and some measures that the community could hold us accountable to. If we say we're going to do these things at this cost or we're on this schedule, are we meeting those schedules? And make that information available on the website and just communicate. And then the last thing that'll be part of a planning document is rapid response planning. And so two potential things that quickly come to mind on rapid response planning are like big failures or big things that happen that get in the news that the district has to be quickly able to respond to and provide data to customers. And then the second thing that happens that we hear happening in other districts and other areas of the country are negative and false Facebook and these kind of posts that start. The district wants to have a plan in their public engagement plan of how to respond to those, how to communicate with the public quickly so that maybe misinformation doesn't spread about the district. Those are a couple of the technical items that we'll look to plan. And then lastly, financial planning. So important to continue to consider as we plan the project milestones and plan for the bond schedules and the cash flow projections, and consider continuously updating the financial model so we know we're on track or we're ahead or we're behind. So those kind of things will be part of the financial piece of the implementation plan. And so that's just a high-level introduction to implementation plan that we're going to start in earnest with the district and work on over the next 3 months, and we'll be back in September to share those plans with you and get your input on those plans.
I think we asked this earlier too. I mean, are you also still looking at federal and state monies too that are a possibility?
Federal and state grants?
Yeah, or anything that could help. Do they offer that or?
Yeah, no, I think continuously those kind of things, when they become available, the district does a good job of taking advantage of those.
Yes, I'd like to add on to that.
we have very limited outside dollars, as we've discussed. There is some state funding through what's called the Integrated Regional Water Management Plan, which is our funds that are distributed through our local regional water authority, and we're always looking for dollars through that program. But the funding for that program is actually drying up, and so unless they replenish those dollars, there'll be even less dollars on a go-forward basis. So the other thing is we will be talking to a legislative advocate at the federal level to see if there's dollars, programmatic or otherwise, through the federal budget, and we'll be getting to visit with our congressman more and more. We are looking at a trip to DC next year, where we would have some agency-specific business meetings to look at those opportunities. So we are going to look at them, but a cautionary note about that, there really is not a lot of outside non-ratepayer funding for this program, and that's something we've really tried to highlight for this group.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
And Jenna, I think we're ready for the next topic.
At this time, I would look for members of the public, if there's anyone that has any comment. Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. It's 8:20. The next item is the facilitators report, and Laura, maybe you can go over what's going to happen to September 10th.
So as Missy indicated, and as you can see on your chart of all of the various CAC meetings, in September when you meet, you will review the implementation plan in much more detail and the phasing for your alternative, and then also review the final recommendation that will be going to the board for alternative 5.4. So that's really the main content for the meeting in September. Since we are near the end of our agenda, let's just go around and just get a sense of what you're taking away from tonight and from the CAC members, and then I will give it back to Jenna to close the meeting. So why don't we go this way, and then that way you'll be the last one, Jenna.
I'm very satisfied with the outcome. I can talk to my neighbors, I can talk to my customers, and feel really good and solid with the outcome of 5.4. Thank you.
I found out of tonight one of the most interesting things is the community engagement side of things, and the work that the district needs to do in improving that. Personally, anything that comes in the mail that's not money coming in or money coming out, it goes into the trash. So, hearing that there's funds dedicated to outreach, but it's flyers, and there probably could be a lot more work in more direct community engagement that would better approach the younger generations, and maybe as an idea, start looking at some of the elementary schools. Kids need to know about conservation efforts, and that might be a great way to step in there and talk about not only infrastructure management but conservation.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for having the Sunrise as part of the discussion. It's been a pleasure, and we wish you well.
Thanks. I too have said quite a bit tonight, so I'll pass the baton.
I have nothing to add.
Good, we are moving forward. Thank you.
Great.
I think it's got a lot of momentum. I think the energy is in the right direction. So I think it has a chance to get legs.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I too am satisfied with the process. I've never participated in anything like this, so I enjoyed learning, and so that when I do get the increase, I'm not just going, not again, and so I understand, what's gone into it, and thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I've enjoyed being a part of the process, and I'm happy with our results. Don't think I'll be happy when my bill comes, but I feel like it's justified.
I think it's been a good process, and there's been a lot of education that's happened here. Gosh, I wish everybody could have this level of education, but it might fall on us to help share what we've learned.
I enjoyed also kind of learning the backside of the surveys. I'm probably not the only one who gets surveys, and it's just interesting kind of looking at what the questions were and what the takeaway and how that informs the material that was, for instance, presented this evening on the pieces that help in the decision-making, the rate sensitivity. That was very interesting, because on one side of our brains, I'm sure we all are sensitive to big bills versus small bills, but just looking at how that was part of the whole picture was very interesting. And the challenge also for Citrus Heights Water to distinguish itself. It's probably useful to be, I was mentioning over there, out of the gate first, and really take away and promote the assets, the Great Citrus Heights Water, the reliability, particularly since our electricity is no longer reliable, but the water is going to be there and we're going to maintain it, and we all have a share in doing that. Sometimes it helps to listen and offer to be the speaker at almost anything around, to talk about your water district and how wonderful Citrus Heights water is for the people in Orangevale. You know, that's the kind of thing that will help also in another way of getting the word out. And this has really been great, and I feel really surprised and good. As a surprised kind of, because you made the process so informative and so easy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm really happy about the process overall and happy to be a participant, so thank you for that. And I'm kind of curious about the public outreach. I don't know if we would be able to eventually hear some feedback as the public gets more educated as to this project. It would be nice to be able to hear more and more people that are on board with it in a positive way.
Right.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Say it's been an honor and privilege, as many of you guys have said, to be on the board, and I've learned a lot on this process. And I also agree with Ms. Berg's comments there too, making this a positive out. It's going to be easier to talk to other people who ask questions.
Thanks again to all you for your continued participation. I've definitely taken a lot of education away from this experience myself, and it's been a great opportunity to serve my community. I hope you feel those same warm feelings of being able to give back in a really concrete way that you could tell other people about. So thanks again.
Before you close?
Yes.
And before you close, just to remind you of the date and the time of the next meeting on September 10th, Tuesday at 6:30. So your job is not done. We still need you to come back for the last meeting, and it would be really important to give feedback on the implementation plan and the final recommendation to the board. So we really look forward to seeing you then. Okay. Give it back to Jenna.
Great. School's out for summer. Yeah, have a nice one. It's 8:28.